Hello everyone. I am now finally doing my Star Resonance dungeon tier list. I actually originally had recorded this before I had released all of the videos of the dungeons, at least all the ones I did have. But I realized that I probably should actually upload the videos of the dungeons first before I rate them all, so that you guys can look at them for yourselves and whatnot. But in general, I'm going to be rating them on like 4 different things, right? Which includes their aesthetic, their mechanics for both the mobs of the dungeon as well as the boss, the length of the dungeon as well as the difficulty, again, of the mobs and or the boss. And just a reminder, this is 110% subjective. This is not based off on any objective data or anything. This is literally just saying what I feel like are the best dungeons and what I feel like are maybe dungeons that need a bit more work. But without further ado, we'll get into it. Oh, I should also reference that I will only be rating the hard dungeons, and I'll probably have footage playing in the background for each of them aside from Kanamiya Trial because I just don't have any footage for it. So the first dungeon that you do is Goblin Nest. And aesthetically, I think it's okay for the aesthetics of the dungeon. It is the first dungeon, right? So it's kind of that first level vibe. I mean, it's just this kind of grassy, cave-like, rocky area. It's nothing like too crazy. There are like these glyph walls and wards, I guess, which is kind of neat, but otherwise not like super interesting in that regard. But it's decent enough, especially for a first dungeon. And in terms of the mechanics, there are actually some interesting mob mechanics. There's like some like really big AoEs that like are nearly impossible to dodge. There's the like flamethrower and wind stuff you have to dodge as you transfer from like room to room. And there's some enemies that you like specifically kind of need to target, not only to progress through the room, but also like some of the enemies actually hit just a lot harder than others, so you want to prioritize killing them first. Again, in my video, we were all over leveled for Goblin Nest, but at lower levels, it's actually like more reasonable for the damage that the mobs actually do. It's definitely a little bit more respectable when your ability score is actually matching the dungeon. And then in terms of the length of the dungeon, it's actually a pretty decent length. I know that, again, we go through it quite fast, but compared to some other dungeons I'll talk about, it's probably like pretty adequately long in terms of the actual amount of rooms, because I think there's at least like 3, maybe 4 rooms, I think, before you meet the requirement for it, which is like a decent amount. Of course, I mean, there's sectioned off rooms in some of the other dungeons that aren't really like that. They're a little bit more open, so maybe that makes it feel more linear than it would otherwise be. I guess that depends on your perspective, but I felt like it was sufficiently long, especially for a first dungeon. And then in terms of difficulty, again, we did it at a higher ability score, so it was kind of hard to tell, but there weren't anything that was super difficult. I mean, the most difficult thing was probably either there's like a fire mob that's in like the 3rd room that can do quite a bit of damage, as I referenced earlier. But outside of that, it's basically just the boss and the shield part where you have to bounce the ball. That's probably the hardest part, if I'm being honest. Everything else after that everything else after that or before that is not really that difficult at all. It's just that one mechanic in the boss that's that punishing. But otherwise, all the other mechanics are pretty straightforward, I think. Nothing too crazy. But again, it's the first level, so I don't think it needs to be crazy. And I think I'm just going to put it in good tier because I think it is good for a starting dungeon. I think it meets kind of all the requirements. Everything is relatively straightforward, I think. Especially for like tanking, because again, this is actually one of the only dungeons that has the walls with the glyph wards or whatever you want to call it. And it kind of sections off the dungeon, which makes it easier for tanks to figure out like how they can pull the mobs, like how many of them they can pull and how far they can pull them, like a wall to wall, as they would say in like a Final Fantasy game. But moving on to Tina's Mine Realm. So I'm actually immediately going to put this in fun tier. I think, and I've maybe mentioned it before even in the comments of some of my previous videos, that this is probably one of my favorite dungeons. Now, admittedly, so we'll go through the categories. Aesthetically, I like it. I like kind of this ruinous, burned down kind of forest fire area. It's very drastic what's happening. But not only that, it's also happening in someone's mind. So this is kind of in that supernatural kind of vibe where we're inside someone's head, right? So none of this is actually real. And I kind of dig those types of things. It's quite different from Goblin Nest in that regard, where now we're all of a sudden in someone's head. So just completely different aspect of fantasy there. But not only that, the length of the dungeon for this one is one of the shortest. I think it might be the second shortest. It's really only 2 rooms, if you even want to call it that. It's basically 2 mob pools, and that's it. But the mobs, I think, are a lot more interesting in this one. You have some mobs that will target specific players with like some spread markers. You don't want to, hit other people with them. And there's like one of the big mobs, I think, does this pretty massive AoE that, again, we were, far above the item or ability score for it. But I think if you were matching the ability score, it probably did about half everyone's health aside from the tank. So there are some just like nearly undodgeable raid wides that would go off in the middle of the mob pool that the healer would have to heal through, and I always love having actual usage for the healer. And so the pulse, they hit a little bit harder in this one, like definitely a decent amount harder. And again, there were just more things to deal with between some ranged mobs as well as ones that, again, would target other people than the tank that you might have to dodge, and then the raid wides going off and whatnot. It wasn't anything too crazy mob-wise, but it was certainly a lot more than what we were getting, I think, in Goblin Nest. Or at least it was more demanding in that regard of, again, requiring healing and maybe some more targeted focus on certain mobs. But otherwise, relatively short dungeon. And then we get to the boss, right? The boss, Tina in this case, I know it's kind of a spoiler, but it's the name of the dungeon. She has a lot of mechanics, honestly, in comparison to Goblin Nest. There are a lot of mechanics, especially the whole ad phase, where not only do you have to kill the ads, but you have to dodge the conal AoEs, and someone typically has the purple circle or purple debuff on them that lasts 30 seconds, and they die if they don't pass it to someone else off by the time the 30 seconds go off. And whoever has it at the end of the ad phase is targeted for a tank buster. It's a lot going on at once. And there's also the mini game with the wardrobes. There's the other conal AoEs that are quite a bit faster than the ones that are in Goblin Nest, and they rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise sometimes. I think it depends. I don't think it's ever just one direction. So there's a lot going on mechanically, and it kind of goes with the difficulty as well, where it's definitely a step up in difficulty for sure. This boss, I think, is one of the more difficult bosses, and the dungeon is, I think, definitely a little bit more difficult. It's still probably not that hard, and I think it being the second dungeon, again, it was easy for people to get really high ability score in comparison to it, so it's really hard to kind of estimate how that would really play out if people were more synced to the ability score of the dungeon. But I think it was still definitely, like, all of it was steps in the right direction, and in my opinion, especially, really, I love the boss fight, but even the mob pulls I don't mind. They're not like the best per se, but they're better than Goblin Nest ones, I feel. And really the only gripe I have with the dungeon is that it is short. It does get longer in master mode, I believe, but because you actually have access to the other wardrobe at the beginning that you don't normally have access to in hard mode. But otherwise, it's just not that interesting. It's just very short. So I kind of wish the mob pulls were a little bit longer and that there were more rooms and the length of the dungeon was longer. And then we have Towering Ruin. So Towering Ruin, aesthetically, is maybe one of my favorites. I love that futuristic kind of sci-fi, dystopian vibe that it kind of brings. It's got all these like robots and like, well, I guess it's almost like an ancient technology more than it is like a futuristic technology. But I in general, I kind of like those vibes. But I kind of feel like the good stuff ends with the aesthetics. I guess the length of the dungeon is actually pretty appropriate. It is actually one of the longer dungeons, especially compared to Tina, and I'm pretty sure it's actually longer than Goblin Nest. I think it like for sure has in the realm of 4 to 5 rooms, maybe even 6, you could argue. And so in terms of those two things, it's got, you know, good length, good aesthetics, but the mechanics and the difficulty are just not really there, I think. The mechanics more specifically in terms of the mobs, like comparing it to Tina's Mind Realm and honestly Goblin Nest, if you were actually synced at ability score, Towering Ruin, I think even when synced at ability score, is just non-threatening. Like it really isn't. There aren't any interesting things the mobs really do. I think they're like some of the bigger ones sometimes pull you in, but the ground AoE that they do as a result of pulling you in is not very big. So you can just run away or dodge away with whatever and you'll be fine. Or I think you can take the hit and it's not actually, you know, that hurtful. But in general, the mob pulls were never that interesting. I didn't feel like there's these like little tiny robots that would chase you and explode, and I think would have been cooler if they were like the same AoE as the one in Goblin Nest, where it's like the whole entire room. Like then maybe it did a lot more damage, and then maybe you were forced to like actually kill the small ones faster and like, you know, focus target on them to kill them before they explode. Like something like that would be interesting. Yeah, maybe it doesn't have to be enough to kill the entire party if all of them went off, but like it should still do like quite a decent chunk, I feel like. But I don't think they ever did anything, and their explosion radius was never big enough to justify it. So mob wise it was kind of whatever. And then boss wise, so if you are playing DPS or support, I'd probably put it here. Like realistically, I'd probably put it here. But since I'm also going to be considering the tank's perspective, I feel like I'm gonna put this in the not good tier. And it's because if you play tank into this dungeon, the final boss is so non-interactive that it really makes you wonder what they were thinking when they were designing it. Because it really feels like they were designing it with healers and DPS in mind, and then they kind of just forgot about the tank. Because there's two mechanics that the boss does that are largely completely non-interactive. One of them is when it splits the party into 2 dimensions, or I guess it just separates the healer and the DPS into another dimension. The tank stays behind, and all the tank does during that section is just run from the boss. The boss spins like a fidget spinner, and you just run away from it. It doesn't even do that much damage, and you can try to attack the boss. You will do damage to the boss, but it's not much, if at all. And also it's like hard to target the boss, because if you actually try to target the boss will hit you, and then it'll move through you, and then it'll kind of like just keep going past you, and it'll almost look like it stopped chasing you for a little bit and it has to like wrap around to come to you. So it's very annoying to do that. So most of the time you're just running away from it, which is like okay, but like you're effectively doing nothing now with the boss as the tank. Meanwhile, the DPS and support, you know, they have their healing check in the other dimension. They have to kill these things in time, these mobs in time, or these ads in time. They have to collect the electric balls that drop from them. And then the tank's only other responsibility is guiding everyone to the right portal so that they can come back to the dimension and go under the shield as the raid wide goes off that would otherwise one-shot them. So, like, in paper, it's like kind of an interesting mechanic, and it is for, again, the DPS and healer. I think it's fine, but for the tank it's just non-interactive. And then on top of that, they have the laser mechanic, which is non-interactive for basically everyone, because you have to block lasers from both sides, which, you know, that's cool, that's something you can do. But the boss is untargetable during it. There's nothing to hit there. So you're kind of doing something for like 10-12 seconds where nothing is actually happening. Like, you're just blocking the laser. Maybe you swap it out with someone else if you're not the tank, but the tank can take it basically the whole time. And actually kind of makes it also uninteractive for the tank even in that regard then, because the tank doesn't even need to switch with someone else. But like, there's just so little things to do there, and they really should just make them uptime mechanics, at least the laser one for sure. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to attack the boss in the middle while also blocking the laser. I think that would actually just make it a more interesting mechanic, because any type of thing where you have to deal with multiple stuff simultaneously while still being able to attack something, it kind of creates that challenging flow state for people where it's like, oh, I have to deal with this while also I'm still able to attack the boss, right? Whereas in this case, you just can't attack the boss at all. So I don't know. It's just a really unfortunate boss design in that regard, in both the mechanics as well as the difficulty. I will say that this is probably one of the first dungeons where I think there's been party wipes, because that dimensional phase, some people don't understand it. And so there is definitely a difficulty curve there, but once people understand it, the boss is not hard. It's really just that one mechanic where the dimension separation happens, because you actually really only need 2 people to know what they're doing, because as long as one person is killing enough of the ads in the other dimension, and either the healer or that DPS is picking up the orbs, then the tank just needs to know where the portal is and lead you guys, or lead one person to it, and then you're fine. Even if the other 3 people die, you just resurrect them and then you're good to go. But yeah, so it's just an unfortunate dungeon. I kind of wish that they'll change a little bit of the boss. Like, again, honestly, just have it targetable during the laser part, and I would probably move it up to good. But yeah, that's pretty much it for that. Then we have Kanemiya Trial. Again, I don't have footage for this one, unfortunately. This dungeon, aesthetically, it's pretty decent. I think maybe it could use a little bit more waterfall, watery vibes, wind vibes, I don't know, but it's sufficient for what it's supposed to do. It's definitely the shortest dungeon, as in I don't even think you move to another room once. I think maybe the final boss like arena is like different. Like I think it teleports you to a different arena, but you don't actually physically move anywhere. And I kind of wish that maybe you did. Like I think it would have been more interesting if you had like different arenas that were connected by like a short hallway, and you just like went from one to the other, just to allow for more like visual storytelling in that regard, instead of just being stuck in the same spot and then maybe being teleported to a new area for the final boss. I don't know. I feel like kind of a missed opportunity there, but I understand that it was supposed to be a trial, so it's not supposed to really be a conventional dungeon in that regard, and it really isn't. There aren't really any mob pulls. You're kind of just fighting like effectively 4 different bosses. That being said, the one at the beginning, I think even with ability score being synced, is just not difficult at all. They die quickly, and I don't really know why they're there. But the other ones are pretty interesting. I've done, there's the part where you face like the 4 classes, that some of them are the same classes that, you know, you can play, right? Like the archer, or the marksman. One of them is the wind knight, and one of them I think is maybe the stormblade. I don't really know. But they target people aside from the tank sometimes, especially like the spear one. I've been hit by that as the healer, and it does like a hefty chunk, so it's a little bit chaotic, a little bit fun there. And then there's like the trial of will or whatever, or test of will, test of faith, whatever it is. That stuff is like okay. I don't think it's super interesting, but it's something. And then the final boss is mechanically probably another demanding boss. So this is the only objective analysis I can give in this regard. Objectively, this boss has party wiped any party I've been in more often than any other dungeon in the game. I have experienced a party wipe on Kanemiya Trial more than anything else. Now, that being said, I don't think that mechanically it's super crazy. It does have a decent amount, right? There's some tank busters, there's the fire mark, or the there's like the fire tornado where it throws out the axe and the fire explodes. That area becomes off limits for a little bit. And I feel like it typically targets the healer, but I could be wrong about that. And then there's like the little fire mark where he'll target someone. Could be the tank, could not be the tank. And it'll leave a fire trail on the ground, which has a decent dot, and it'll stay there basically the whole entire rest of the match. So you want to leave it in areas where you aren't going to need to go to. And then you, of course, have the whole spirit, the blue spirit mechanic, which I think is the major mechanic of the fight, where you need to drop it off far enough away so that when the boss starts pulling you into your soul, that you can be far enough away that the suction is not very strong, and you don't get sucked into your soul, which will instantly one-shot you. So mechanically, I actually think that the boss is pretty good in a similar realm of like Tina. I think there's like a decent amount going here. I don't think it's quite as much as Tina, and I think like some things could be a little bit more interesting. There is like the ad phase with the spears, and if you have to kill all the spears within each other fast enough, and if you don't, then one of the spears will, I think, like resurrect, and you'll have to kill it again and make sure that you kill it before the other ones resurrect again. So a little bit of a check there, and you have to like dodge a lot of stuff at the same time. But like other than that, the main thing is just that people for some reason don't respect the spirit one, the spirit mechanic. I don't know if it's because they think that they could just kill through it, or they don't know what they're doing with it, or they don't know what they need to do with it, but they just leave it in the middle of the room, and it just party wipes so many times, or like it nearly party wipes. Like sometimes I survive, maybe the tank survives, hopefully, but a lot of times the DPS will die, and I think in one case the tank did die, and then I had aggro for like the next 10 seconds after the tank revived, because the tank couldn't take it back, and then eventually I think I got just absolutely demolished by the boss, because I think they hit me with a tank buster or something, so it was not great. So it's definitely probably one of the most difficult bosses, at least it was in CBT. It shouldn't be, probably, but it was one of the most difficult dungeons for sure, in that regard, and I'm gonna put it in the good tier. I think I still wish that the length of the actual dungeon itself was longer, and that maybe the mechanics were a little bit more obvious for people, but I do like the boss battle, even though I did dread queuing for this dungeon. I did like it, and like I think if I did it with a group where everyone knew what they were doing, I would totally be fine, totally be happy with this dungeon, because I do think otherwise it's pretty cool. I'd probably put it a little bit above Goblin Nest as well, because aesthetics are a little bit more interesting in my opinion, but otherwise, yeah, I think it's just a good dungeon. And then we have Dragonclaw Valley. So this is another one I'm going to put. I've already made comments about this one. This one might be my favorite dungeon in the game, just in general, or overall, I should say. It's got the hardest mob pulls in the game, for sure. There's some interesting mechanics with it as well. So for one, well, I'll talk about the aesthetics first, I guess. The aesthetics is kind of, it's the Wind Valley area that you can go to if you unlock it on like the right side of Asterlead's open map. And it's a cool area. It's kind of this very nature-esque, canyon, windy, grassy vibe. Kind of How to Train Your Dragon-esque with the canyon and cliff sides and stuff like that. And Dragonclaw Valley, again, kind of takes place in that area, and so I do kind of like that vibe. It's kind of the same vibe that Kanomiya Trial I feel like should have, and they are both very close to each other proximity-wise, but Dragonclaw Valley is just a more interesting one. And it's also actually, I think, the longest dungeon in the game. I think it has the most amount of distance to cover, which is nice, because it is the second to last dungeon, so you'd think that the last dungeons would start to be a little bit harder, a little bit longer, and it's definitely harder on the mob pulls, as I was mentioning earlier. The ranged mobs are menaces. They will like 2 or 3 tap your tank if you guys are not ready. So the strategy kind of changes here, where you have to actually focus on specific mobs, mainly the ranged ones. You need to stun them and try to mow them down before they can, get a lot of damage off, because they will one-tap the tank. And if they kill the tank, it is possible for the tank to survive them, but they just deplete their HP so quickly and so hard. If the tank dies, the rest of the party will typically die within a couple seconds. I've had that on that dungeon. That dungeon has almost had as many deaths as Kanomiya Trial, but not from the boss, from the mobs, or the mob pulls. So this one definitely has the hardest ones, and it also having the longest dungeon. There's like 3 or 4 places I think we've died before, and it's just because those ranged ones hit hard. But not only that, there's also some other interesting mob mechanics. There's like this one where I think the ranged ones will sometimes target the healers and DPS, with an undodgeable or nearly undodgeable, unseeable, I guess, attack. Although I don't think it does nearly as much damage as the just regular autos do on the tank. And then what does do actually quite a bit is like there's tornado will spawn and it'll have 4 tornadoes that actually intersect that one area. That can do quite a bit of damage. I've seen that actually like one-shot people before. So definitely some mechanics to really look out for, as well as, you know, deal with the mobs during the mob pulls. And it's just a very tight dance between the healer and tanks there, as well as the DPS to just make sure that they can burst down the ranged mobs before anything happens. And then again, I already talked about length, right? It's one of the longest dungeons, and I think it's fairly appropriate for it being like the second to last dungeon. And then there are the mechanics and difficulty of the boss, right? So the boss itself is pretty interesting. I think mechanically there's a decent amount going on here. There's the spread markers where you drop the green crystals, and you destroy them, and then they drop this kind of green orb, which you could pick up to do more like wind damage, I think it is, but you don't necessarily need to pick it up yet. And you know, as you do more damage to the boss, I think there's, you know, some general like AoEs, projections on the floor, like conal AoEs and whatnot that you can dodge. Pretty normal stuff there. But then the boss can go flying, not up, but around the map, and will start swiping with its wing, and you have to dodge it while also dodging tornadoes, and it's pretty cool. It is technically a downtime mechanic, and it's a little bit unfair because for some reason on the side that the wing isn't swiping on, lightning strikes in a quadrant of that side, and I don't really understand what that's for, because both did a decent chunk of my health when I got hit by one or the other. So I guess like only like actually 25% of the arena is safe on each swipe, which isn't necessarily like too much of a problem, but the lightning part does not make sense. I don't know why lightning strikes the safe side, or what would seemingly be the safe side of the arena. That doesn't really make sense to me. That's very hard to read that would ever happen until you get hit by it. But after that, you'll be able to target the boss again, and eventually it will try and charge up a attack, and it'll create a barrier around itself. Shield health is really what it looks like on the boss's HP bar, and you will have to break through that barrier to move on. And it's actually a soft enrage, because the boss will start roaring and doing a raid-wide tick of damage, and for each raid-wide, the boss will have this little buff icon on them, and it'll have a number, and that number will keep going up every time they roar. And each time they roar, the next roar attack, the next raid-wide AoE, will now do more damage. So it's actually literally a DPS check. You have to kill or break through the shield in time, or else everyone is going to get one-tapped by the AoE eventually if you don't have enough damage. And that's where the wind orbs can come in handy, because you can actually use those wind orbs to increase your damage and dramatically speed up the phase where you burst down the barrier. After that, boss becomes vulnerable for a little bit, you attack it, and then it eventually flies straight up into the air, and you have to chase after it. So you go up into the air, you actually use your hover for the first time, really in a dungeon. You can use hover in the other dungeons, but it's not really ever forced. So you actually use it to chase this boss, and eventually you go up and you find 4 floating islands that are much smaller in size than the one you were previously on. And you need to find the one that the boss is actually on, because it's kind of napping and trying to heal. So you attack it, it wakes up, it stops the healing, and then you kind of continue into phase 2. Now, my honestly biggest gripe with this dungeon is that the boss just doesn't have enough health. Maybe in master mode that kind of gets fixed, but the boss just does not have an appropriate amount of health for the amount of phases and mechanics it has, because you can so easily bypass all of them, even if you were at the normal ability score of it. Because in second phase, there's supposed to be a decent amount that can happen. I think the green crystal spreads, or spread AoEs can happen again, but you're on a much smaller platform, so you have to be a little bit more careful with where you're positioning yourself relative to everyone else on your team, right? And the other thing is the tank gets a proximity AoE marker, and they actually need to drop that off at another island. And they really should, because I've seen what happens when you don't, which is that they one-shot the rest of the team when they decided to not care about the mechanic, and admittedly I probably could have tried to get as far away from them on the same island as I could have, and maybe I would have survived with a little bit of HP, but we got one shot regardless, because the tank decided to not respect the mechanic and kill us all in the process. But in general, the tank is supposed to bring it to another island so that it can go off there, and then the boss might chase the tank to the new island that the tank is on, which means that everyone would have to chase after the boss to that new island. So a little bit of island hopping shenanigans there. And in general, I think like a lot of these mechanics are pretty cool. They're pretty interesting. You got some healer checks, you got some tank position checks, some DPS checks. It's got kind of a bit of everything. And I think it's fairly straightforward in that regard as well. It can be, I think, maybe the most buggy fight, but it wasn't actually that bad from what I had seen. I didn't have any bug issues with it compared to, I think, what China had when they first encountered this dungeon. But in general, I think it's one of my favorite dungeons, and it's for sure gonna be probably my highest rated dungeon on this list. And then we have Dark Mist Fortress. So Dark Mist Fortress is pretty decent. It's definitely maybe the second longest dungeon. The mob pulls are kind of like Towering Ruin, where like they're not that difficult. I think I'm gonna put this in good for now. The mob pulls aren't really that difficult, despite it being, you know, the highest ability score requirement. It was like almost 11,000 to get in. So I would have assumed that it would, you know, everything would hit hard, and it's not that it doesn't hit hard. There's definitely some amount of hard hitting aspects to it. But it just wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. Aesthetically, it's kind of this dark fortress vibe. I'm not super into it, I think, maybe as some other people are, but it's, you know, it does its job. It's pretty good. And again, the length of the dungeon is pretty good as well. Although admittedly, they have these transportation little yellow glowing pillars, and they really need to adjust the gravity stuff with them, because the one that rises you can easily mess up, because you have to like jump in it and then wait until you're at the peak of your jump to double jump so that you can actually make the clearance of the pillar, because it's basically zero gravity there, or low gravity there, but you need to go up to the second floor. And if you use your first jump and then your second jump immediately, you actually won't make it up high enough, even with the low gravity. So you have to like time your jumps or space your jumps out while staying still in the pillar, because the pillar is about the size of your character and maybe a little bit bigger. So if you move out of it, you'll lose the gravity. And so it's a little bit janky there, and I've seen people get stuck there. I've kind of been stuck there. It's very annoying. Same thing for the one going down, because there's very clearly a gap where it looks like you could just fall down, but you actually have to just go into the pillar to fall down again, and it's very slow. So yeah, it's just, there's some navigation aspects of the dungeon that aren't that interesting. But admittedly, during the mob pull, there's a void corruption that you gather, and you need to cleanse it before it reaches 100, because it'll one-shot you. And there's different things that can give you void corruption. I think you just naturally gain it over time. I think some of them mobs can give it to you as well, or can increase it. And in general, you just have to be wary of that. But there are a lot of cleansing machines throughout the mob pull room, so I don't really think it's that difficult. And again, in general, the mob pulls, there were some interesting things. There was like some ranged ones that would target the DPS constantly, or the healers constantly, and you have to kind of spread them so that you're not like getting hit by the same hit or overlapping them and, you know, giving too much damage. But I don't know, I never really experienced like as difficult of healing checks or anything like that playing a healer. I think it was definitely probably harder than Towering Ruin pulls, and maybe even Goblin Nest pulls for sure, but it didn't seem like anything crazy like Dragonclaw Valley or even really Tina's Mind Realm was causing. So I didn't notice anything particularly in that regard. But when it comes to the final boss definitely has quite a bit of mechanics and was definitely more on the difficult side. I've definitely had party wipes on Dark Mist Fortress final boss, and it was kind of due to a plethora of reasons, but one is, during the first phase was usually never that bad. The only issue with first phase is actually the transition part, where the tank has to block the big sword. It's very similar to the Final Fantasy Stormblood trial, except it's just a lot less fun. Because this is another example of it's a downtime mechanic, and if you're playing as the tank, it feels very boring. Because you basically go into the middle of the room, you hit one button, and then that's all you do for like, you don't even have to like hold down the button, you just press it once, and then you just eat some popcorn for like 10 or 12 seconds as you watch the gameplay itself. There's really nothing else for you to do. Everyone else, however, there's damage going out, so there's some healing check to be done there. But you also have to block these purple void orbs, and it gives you, the void corruption, so you eventually need to cleanse that with the machines that are in the corner of the room. And just want to block them from getting to your tank so that your tank doesn't accidentally become corrupted, because the tank can't cleanse their own void corruption because they're stuck in the middle. It's just, there should be something to attack. Again, similar critique as with Towering Ruin. There should be something to attack here. There's no reason that you should not be able to attack the boss, or even the sword. Maybe the sword should have HP like it does in Final Fantasy XIV. They just have something to attack while you're doing all this. It would be way more interesting. And then in terms of the tank, again, in Final Fantasy, it was a mashing minigame. In this one, it's not. I don't necessarily know that the mashing minigame would be that much better. But maybe I think it just shouldn't last quite as long as it does right now. It does last quite long. I think it actually lasts longer than the Final Fantasy XIV one. I know that they swing the sword twice in the Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood trial, but it still feels shorter than the one that we have, which just feels way longer while also not having you attack anything. And then it goes into a cutscene transition. So it really is like the tank just doesn't do anything for like almost what feels like a quarter of the fight. But then we go into phase 2, and phase 2 is like actually a decent amount more interesting. There's a giant, not really a barrier, but there's a midsection cut out in going through the center of the room. A giant kind of void crack going through the center of the arena. And for anyone that goes through it, it deals a raid wide when you cross over that deals a hefty chunk of everyone's HP, almost like half of everyone's HP, I'd say. And so if too many people try to cross over, it will kill everyone. And I've seen that happen, and I've experienced that happening before. It does a lot of damage. But the way that you deal with that is that if one person crosses over, everyone can cross over at the same time as them, basically. When one person goes over, you have like a 1 to 2 second gap for anyone else to cross over without triggering the raid wide again. But if you are too delayed and you go after, maybe 1 or 2 seconds after the first person goes, then you can trigger the raid wide again when you try to cross over. And you will be forced to, because the boss will be on one side of the arena that you might be attacking him on, and then eventually he's going to cleave that whole entire side, so you need to cross over to the other side, but you have to time it with the rest of your team. So there's definitely a little bit of interesting mechanic in that regard. But even when you're on one side of the arena, there's some spread markers that the DPS will get. I think sometimes the healer will get them as well. There's puddle markers where you need to drop it, and it'll leave a, I think, nearly permanent puddle. Maybe the puddle does go away. I haven't really noticed. But it does do quite a hefty bit of damage if you stand in it. So you need to try and drop those puddles away from the boss so that people don't accidentally step on it while trying to do damage. There's also just a lot of AoEs going off on the floor that you have to dodge. Some of them cover the entire section that you're on, but they go off in a certain order, so you need to like go into the last one first and then dodge into the first ones that go off. So definitely some kind of very Final Fantasy-esque AoE type of patterns and whatnot, which was neat to see. And in general, that like phase 2 is pretty enjoyable. Like I actually do enjoy phase 2 of the boss. And it's probably why I think I'd put it on the higher end of the good tier. There is an argument maybe that I would put it in fun, but I think it's just the mob pulls were never interesting enough, and phase 1 just kind of sucks in comparison to like the Tina or Dragonclaw bosses. So I think I'm just gonna put it at the top of good tier. But I think this is pretty much my opinions on the dungeons for now. Again, these are just the hard mode dungeons. I don't know about the master mode dungeons. They might change a lot of stuff, like maybe Towering Ruin I'd put a lot higher because it's probably going to be harder to actually heal through and do all that stuff. But in general, I will say, I think all of the dungeons were pretty good. Like even Towering Ruin, again, if you were playing healer or DPS, it's up here, right? If you're not playing, if you're playing tank, maybe you would still find it being up here, but for me personally, for a tank, it's not really that interesting, so I'd probably put it here. But in general, I think all the dungeons are pretty good overall, especially for the type of game it is. I wasn't necessarily expecting for the dungeons to be that good, although I was really hoping that they would be, and I think they are. I genuinely do think that they are. Regardless if it's like Dragonclaw Valley or Tina's Mind Realm or the Kanomia Trial, Goblin Forest, they're all quite fun to do. I think they would be more fun with ability syncing, so that you don't just breeze through like Goblin Nest or Tina's Mind Realm with ease, because it does kind of ruin both the length of the dungeon as well as the difficulty, and even to some degree the mechanics, because you just skip over them completely and you never see them in the fight. So I do hope that maybe again eventually they'll have an ability score syncing or something there, but in general all the dungeons really fun, and I enjoy them quite a bit, and I'm really looking forward to what their new dungeons are going to look like if they add any in season 2 for China. I'm interested to see kind of what they will cook in terms of more boss fights, because there's definitely way more that they could push. None of these are that hard compared to some of the stuff I've done. Some of this is hard, I think, for the average player, maybe, especially for people who aren't really used to MMO mechanics in an action-based one with a Trinity system, where tanks have certain things that they need to deal with, healers have certain things they need to do, and DPS have certain things they need to do. There's definitely some amount of difficulty and learning curve there. But, you know, for someone who has cleared, admittedly, the easiest ultimate raid in Final Fantasy XIV, and I did the first floor of Savage for the Dawntrail Savage raids for the Arcadian series, and I've done every extreme so far in Dawntrail as well, which, again, these aren't the hardest fights in the game by any means, but they are supposed to be harder fights than average. Most of the player base doesn't clear them, or even attempts to clear them, right? So there's definitely way more they can limit test, but again, they're looking for a casual audience, so we'll see. Maybe they'll do harder fights in the future, but I'm very interested to see what they're gonna be capable of doing. But without further regards, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.